A few months ago, I made a video about 23andMe. So if you haven't seen that one yet, you might want to pause this video, go back and watch that one, and then come back and watch this one. Okay. So I got my results back a few weeks ago, and I would like to talk about them. I'm sorry that I didn't do this video sooner. I have been extremely busy. There's been a lot on my plate. And also there's the fact that the story on DNA testing keeps changing pretty much every day. Just after I made my first video about 23andMe came the news that the FDA was basically yelling at them for making promises with their health analyses that weren't necessarily backed up by the data. And mostly, though, for just not communicating with the FDA. And because of that, the FDA ordered them to stop providing the health overviews to their customers. So I was afraid that I wasn't going to get my health analysis, but I don't know if it's because I sent my kit off well before the FDA decision, even though I got the results back after the decision. Anyway, I got my health overview. I talked a little bit about my feelings about the FDA decision over on my podcast, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. You can see a link in the doobly-doo. And just to sum up my feelings, they're basically that, do I think that 23andMe was overselling its health analysis? No, I really think that they weren't. But I do think that they should have been in constant communication with the FDA. It sounded to me as though they really, really bunged that up. So when I got my results, I wanted to look at them through the eyes of the FDA and see if there was, in fact, things that the average consumer could take out of context, perhaps misunderstand, and maybe freak out about. And my initial perspective pretty much backed up my original opinion, which is that no, it was all pretty well explained. I looked at my health overview and I saw that according to the genetic sample, I had an elevated risk of age-related macular degeneration and atrial fibrillation. 23andMe stated that these results had a high degree of confidence, so they were pretty sure that I did in fact have the genetic markers for these diseases. Clicking on one of the diseases gives a big overview of exactly what the disease is, what my risks are compared to the risks of an average person, and also includes an estimation of how much of this disease is based on genetics versus environment, and also talks about recent research to help me prepare for getting this disease or maybe even possibly preventing it. And everything that I could see was pretty well couched with various warnings about how, this doesn't mean that you are definitely going to get this disease. Following these prevention tips does not necessarily mean you will avoid it, all of that stuff. So I was actually pretty impressed with that. There were two conditions that weren't on the overall health overview. Those were risk of Alzheimer's disease and risk of breast cancer. In order to view my relative risks for those, I had to click through to a different page and then confirm that I'd read through a list of warnings about what the data could and could not tell me about these diseases. Presumably because these are the diseases that really freak people out the most. So I did not read any of the warnings. I scrolled to the bottom and clicked OK, just like you do with any software license. And it was only after I clicked OK that I stopped myself and realized what I had done. And that was my first hint that maybe there is a bit of a concern there with the average person not actually paying attention to the warnings that 23andMe even puts out there. So I ignored all the warnings, looked at my results. Luckily for me, I guess, I had a lower risk for both of those. If I'd had a higher risk, I really would have wanted to go back and read those warnings. But when I went back, they were gone. So that wasn't great. Back to the regular list of conditions, one of them that caught my interest was essential tremor. It's the most common movement disorder, and it can look like Parkinson's, but it appears to be only cosmetic. It's basically, jerking your hands and maybe your head, and it can, if it's very bad, it can get in the way of things. My SGU co-host the other night just said, well, yeah, if you like eating soup with a spoon, it can be difficult. But that one caught my eye because a close relative of mine was diagnosed with it last year. And ever since then, I've been a bit paranoid about it. Like whenever I'm just sitting watching TV or something, I will sometimes stop and wonder, was I just shaking my head? Is it happening to me? Because I'd heard that it was genetic. And according to 23andMe, I do have a heightened risk. But their confidence of that was much, much lower than for the results for macular degeneration, for instance. So knowing that I do possibly have a genetic risk of essential tremor, and knowing that I have a family history of it, it actually has upped my paranoia. And I have wondered, what if there was a more serious disease? What if it was a more serious disease like Alzheimer's or like breast cancer? If there was a family history and I got this back from 23andMe, my paranoia would be through the roof, completely uncontrollably through the roof. So again, I can sympathize with those who worry that people aren't prepared to handle this much information. So then I went and I looked at my ancestry results, and I have to tell you that I have the most boring genes ever. I'm 99.6% European, which, my family has never been much for knowing our ancestry, but that's pretty much what we've always told each other. It's, yeah, we're mostly British and Irish, and that's what came back. Yep, mostly those things. I'm 0.2% East Asian and Native American, and let's see, according to the results, I'm 100% Rebecca Watson. It actually lists that. I would be honestly pretty freaked out if it was anything less than 100%. 23andMe also tells you how much Neanderthal you have in you. So the next time you're at a bar and someone asks if there's any Neanderthal in you, and if you'd like some, you can tell them, honestly. I am 2.5% Neanderthal, which again is very disappointing. That's slightly lower than the average European. I was really disappointed because I quite like Neanderthals, and I always think of them as the smarter, more cultured underdog compared to their violent neighbors who possibly interbred with them and destroyed them. There are lots more things you can do with your DNA once you've got the results from 23andMe. 23andMe offers other tools like this lab that will make a little song out of your genetic material. Here's mine. It's okay, I guess. It's again, it's kind of boring, really. Maybe if you add somebody else in as somebody else's DNA as drums or something, it could liven it up. I don't know. It is what it is. There are also other places you can go around the internet. Other than 23andMe, you can take your raw data from 23andMe and put it into various tools that people have created to analyze DNA. Unfortunately, most of these tools are focused on people who have a pretty solid understanding and familiarity with DNA and with genetics. I do not. It's certainly not my field of expertise. But still, I wanted to try one of the tools. So I found one that looks at your DNA to determine how many runs of homozygosity are in it. And so I ran my DNA through that. And while that was working, I went and looked up what runs of homozygosity are. And it turns out that these are just portions of your DNA that are identical that came from both your mother and your father. So you got an identical bit of DNA from both your mother and your father. And the more of these runs of homozygosity, also known as ROH, the more of those and the longer they are, the better the chance that your parents were more closely related. So, for instance, if your parents were siblings, then your DNA would be absolutely lousy with ROH. So I took a look at my results, and this is what I got. My total megabytes of ROH was 86.5. And that was really great to know. And I had no idea what to do with that information because the tool itself is for people who know what they're doing and not for people who don't know what a low number looks like compared to what a high number looks like. Basically how to analyze the results. So I went on a bit of a search, and I swear I spent about 90 minutes learning about runs of homozygosity, reading papers, looking at charts to try to determine if my parents were related or not. And there was one point where I determined that 86.5 total megabytes was just a tremendously huge number, and that my parents were most definitely at least cousins. But then I found some more papers and learned a bit more about how it's a bit more complex than that. And anyway, at some point, 90 minutes into this with about 15 Chrome tabs open, as I'm flicking back and forth, reading papers, reading Wikipedia pages, trying to understand this stuff, I realized this is the problem that the FDA is worried about. It's somebody with a little bit of information going on a wild goose chase. And for me, the worst possible scenario there was me, telling my mom that I think she's related to my dad and her patiently explaining to me that, no, that's not true. But, if we're talking about diseases, if we're talking about people who would not only go on this sort of journey to learn more about this topic, but also act upon it in a possibly unhealthy way, that can be quite dangerous. So I've spent a long time trying to figure out how I feel about the whole thing. And if I agree with some people who suggest that the genetic analysis just should not be open to the general public, that it shouldn't be available without having a physician right there to, or a genetic counselor, for instance, right there to explain the results to you and answer any questions. It shouldn't be done just on anybody. It should be done only in special cases, or it should only be done once we have the ability to create a more complete picture of a person's DNA, once we have a better understanding of how DNA affects our health compared to our environment, things like that. And at the end of the day, though, I still have to stand behind the idea that 23andMe and other companies are ultimately a good thing. I think that ultimately this information should be available. And I think that ultimately it will be very helpful to have it available. I do think that we're in for a long, rocky period where humanity learns to deal with a huge influx of new information in much the same way that we learn to deal with WebMD, and the internet in general. We change and we adapt. And yes, that WebMD has caused many doctors many headaches with patients who are self-diagnosing. But ultimately, more information is going to be a good thing. We just need to figure out how to deal with it. And so while we work all that out, I just hope that companies like 23andMe get on their best behavior and learn to work with the FDA so that all of us can move together towards a more awesome future.